Unconfined is a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. A podcast about industrial food animal production and its emerging alternatives. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu. Mike Milley is our sound engineer and produced our theme music. Your hosts are me, Tom Philpott, and Christine Grillo. Paulette Wilson is our producer, and Natalie Wood Wright is the executive producer. The opinions expressed here are not necessarily those of Johns Hopkins University or of the Center for a Livable Future. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Unconfined Podcast. In this episode, we're going to dive into the murky waters of salmon farming. And we have as our guests, Doug Frantz and Catharine Collins. They wrote a book that came out in 2023 called Salmon Wars, The Dark Underbelly of Our Favorite Fish. It's an amazing book. Just a few words about them. Doug Frantz is a veteran journalist, former managing editor of the LA Times, investigative reporter and foreign correspondent in Istanbul for the New York Times. And during his time there, he was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize. He's also worked for the Chicago Tribune and has served as the State Department's Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs. The co-author is Catharine Collins. She's been the foreign correspondent and a reporter at the Chicago Tribune and written for the LA Times and New York Times. And together, they're co-authors of 7 books on topics as diverse as nuclear trafficking and Disney's master plan suburb down in Florida. And so, let's start there. What drew you guys into writing about salmon farming? What brought you into that topic?
Well, on paper, we seem like an odd choice to do this. We aren't biologists, marine biologists, or anything like that. But salmon has always been on my radar simply because my dad was a big angler and he loved salmon fishing. So I grew up with all those salmon stories and watching him come home with these massive fish that seemed almost as big as I was at the time. It was in actually the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, Anacostia Island, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. He actually went to Alaska a few times. He loved angling, but he was very concerned about the welfare of wild salmon. And he read the research very carefully. He was a member of the Atlantic Salmon Federation, and he was very hopeful at one point that salmon farming would be the answer. But he gave up angling for wild fish in the early 90s, and retired, moved to Nova Scotia, and he was on the shore, and a salmon farm went in close by, and he thought, great opportunity to take a look at this new technology that may solve this huge problem. And he went with a friend out with a glass-bottom boat after he'd been in the water for a couple of years, and they could see that there was no seagrass. There was very little marine life around the salmon farm, and he began to see the waste that would come up on the shore and the trash, and the population of wild fish continued to decline. And he said to us many times, this is not the answer. Wild salmon are going to continue to be in danger, and salmon farms are only making the situation worse. So fast forward, we retired. I can tell you the rest of the story.
And then we moved back to Nova Scotia, and so a neighbor told us about a meeting in a nearby village called Mahone Bay about the possibility of 20 or more salmon farms coming along the coast of Nova Scotia. So we attended that meeting in a town of about 1,000, and there were about 500 people jammed into the community hall and flowing out into the corridors. And we heard there that this influx of salmon farms posed a grave, nearly catastrophic threat to the remaining wild salmon and to the lobster industry, other ecosystems in the water, and to tourism, because these things are pretty damn ugly.
And filthy.
And filthy. And so we came away from that and thought, there's something here we better look into. And both of us have been longtime investigators in addition to her newspaper work, Catherine was a private investigator for 10 years. She never carried a gun, though. Anyway, so we spent the next 3 years researching and writing the book that became Salmon Wars. And what we found not only underscored all of the fears that her father had had many years ago, they also highlighted the increasing dangers from this global industry.
Now, I think it's really interesting that a lot of people at the beginning of salmon farming thought it was a solution to the problems that were being faced by wild salmon. And was the idea that basically that we're overfishing wild salmon, so if we replace it, if we sort of farm salmon off to the side, we can let the wild salmon run and just sort of eat the farm salmon? Was that the original idea?
Yes. Wild salmon had been threatened for many years and for a number of reasons, from acid rain to the construction of dams, the destruction of habitat. Those are the things that initiated the decline in wild Atlantic salmon. The salmon farms, are sort of the nail in the coffin. They like to locate them on wild salmon routes. They are enormous polluters. And when they escape, they can breed with wild salmon and weaken the species in general. The declines have been enormous. In Norway, I think the population of wild salmon has declined by 50% or more. Scotland just reported their figures at 70% or more. Newfoundland near us has just posted a warning that wild salmon are on the brink of extinction in Newfoundland. What are the other numbers? It's astonishing the difference this has made.
Yeah, so you have what was proposed to be a solution, and exactly as you said, they were expected to take pressure off the commercial fishing for wild salmon, but instead they provided yet another downward trend push on the wild salmon population. Wild salmon have declined 70% worldwide over the last 10 years. And the largest declines, as Catherine said, have been around salmon farms.
And even before that, there's a long-term trend of decline. So you are talking about a nail in the coffin situation.
Yes, exactly.
And I guess the co-sighting of farm salmon in places where wild salmon exist is about water temperature and sort of natural conditions like that the aquaculture people want to take advantage of. Is that why they're doing it?
That's part of it, but also they wild salmon migrate. They migrate. They spawn in the spring in rivers in fresh water, and then the young juveniles migrate to saltwater and oceans. And here in North America, they make an amazing migration all the way to Greenland and then come back. And when those juveniles come out of the water, they invariably go near the salmon farms because, as you said, they've been located on these migratory runs for various reasons, one of which is they're easy to access because they're close to the coast where the salmon are coming out of the water. And so these juvenile salmon, when they go past the cages, they're prone to get chemicals and antibiotics. And most importantly, a parasite called sea lice attaches to the juveniles, and 7 or 8 sea lice will kill a juvenile. We've seen photos of 700 or more sea lice on a single adult salmon. And they eat the flesh, they kill them. Sea lice are a huge problem for wild salmon, but they're also a problem for salmon in the cages because they are petri dishes, these cages, where you have 100,000 salmon crammed into a cage smaller than a football field. And they're in there and they're ripe for all kinds of diseases. And the parasites thrive there. And 1 in 4 farmed salmon dies every year. 865 million farmed salmon died in the last decade, according to a new study a peer-reviewed study in Nature, the science journal. So the conditions are horrific, and no other industry would tolerate these kinds of mortality rates.
And so the mortality is just a cost of doing business. You just figure you're going to lose part of your salmon herd, and that's just that.
Compare that to chicken and cows. Chickens die at about a rate of 5% and cows at about 3%. You're losing salmon at a rate worldwide of 25%. And times where you lose all of the salmon, there was a die-off not far from here in 2019, and the farm lost 2.6 million fish in a single die-off that extended over a period of days. That year, Newfoundland harvested fewer fish than died. And that trend has continued since then.
I guess, to control these lice, otherwise you'd just even have more die-offs, then I guess they apply a lot of pesticides into the pen. Is that correct?
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. They use huge amounts of pesticides. They also use huge amounts of antibiotics to fight the diseases like salmon anemia and other diseases that are spawned in these petri dishes of these crowded, filthy pens.
And they're petri dishes that are open to the ocean, so all this stuff that we're talking about kind of escapes into the water, the surrounding water.
Yes, a typical salmon farm, let's say, might have a dozen pens, round or square shaped, and they're all connected with pathways, little bridges between them, and they are about 30 feet deep with a plastic mesh. So the salmon feces goes right through the netting, as do the chemicals, and they lodge on the seabed below. There's an interesting photo you can find online by an amateur diver, Kathy Brush, and they stuck a yardstick, an old-fashioned wooden yardstick, in the seabed below a salmon farm, and it went in right up to the top. So 32, 36 inches worth of feces below the salmon. Do you really want to eat a fish that's swimming in its own feces and chemicals?
It does bring up a lot of parallels to land, sort of these giant CAFOs where they have pigs hanging out right over their own manure. Now, one thing that I think that, we're talking about this industry that has got 25% mortality, that's got all these waste problems, it's got this pesticide problem. And yet, when you go into the fish case of a typical U.S. supermarket, you see lots of Atlantic salmon in there. And talk a little bit about what consumers are getting when they get farmed Atlantic salmon. Because my understanding is basically there is no mass availability of wild Atlantic salmon anymore in the United States. If you see Atlantic salmon in your fish case, it's farmed. What are some of the other things that consumers are getting when they buy farmed salmon like that?
They get a fish that has been raised in its own feces in a pool of chemicals, and those chemicals can collect in they become a residue in the flesh of the salmon. And so there have been studies going back 20 years now showing an increased level of PCBs and other lethal contaminants in farmed salmon flesh. And you may get them in very minute amounts when you eat salmon, but what scientists have found is that this residue collects, it aggregates over your lifetime. PCBs that you consume when you're 20 will still be in your body when you're my age, which is more than 20. So you get those, and scientific studies that we've seen have pointed out that it's particularly risky for pregnant women of childbearing age, and infants and young children to have PCBs and other contaminants in their food because they delay brain growth. And so you're taking a risk when you do this. And you're exactly right about the marketing. All you'll see in the market, even if it's some upscale place like Whole Foods, is fresh Atlantic salmon. Sometimes you'll see farmed, or more often you don't see anything. And there is no government regulation of what these labels should say. One of the things we advocate in our book is putting a QR code on salmon so you can see where it was raised, what kind of chemicals were used in raising it. Instead, people have this iconic image of a wild fish swimming up a river, and that just couldn't be further from the truth.
And this is an area that really needs study. It's been decades since someone has done a serious study of the nutritional value of salmon. And but someone should do it. But there's no doubt that farm salmon is the nutritional equivalent of a wild salmon. They contain more of the omega-6, the bad fatty acids, and less of the omega-3, the good fatty acids. And studies show that farm salmon, the flesh of farm salmon, has lower protein than wild salmon. And, of course, depending on where they were raised and what they were fed and what the environmental issues were in terms of sea lice, you don't know what contaminants are in them at the point when you buy them in order to put them on your table.
And the source of PCBs, I think, gets us to a whole nother big issue behind farm salmon, and that is the feed issue. Isn't that where the PCB comes in the sort of fish meal and fish oil? And I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about that problem, about how salmon are carnivorous fish, and so they have to have some, at least some and probably a lot of fish in their diet, and how all that works, and talk about the fish meal, fish oil industry.
Who's going to do it?
I'll do this, and then you do the positive, okay?
Okay.
I'll do negative. I've done it my whole career. There are a couple of simple facts. It takes 444 wild fish to raise a single farm salmon to market weight. 444 wild fish. Now, where do those wild fish come from? They don't come out of the thin air. They come primarily off the coast of West Africa. And those are pelagic fish. They're mackerel, they're sardines, they're anchovies. 90% of those wild fish that are then ground into fish meal and fish oil to feed salmon and pets and other aquaculture, 90% of them are edible. They could be consumed. And if you look at a place like a low-income area like West Africa, you see subsistence farmers who can no longer make a living. You see women who sold fish in the markets no longer have a product to sell. And that's because as the salmon industry and the rest of aquaculture have grown dramatically, you have huge trawlers from European nations, from China, from other places coming in there and scooping up all of these fish, taking them right out of the food chain so that we can have farmed Atlantic salmon on our dinner table. There are alternatives, and that's one of the things. We've written a lot of books about big problems that can't be solved, like nuclear weapons proliferation. But this is one where we came across a potential solution it's a solution. It could work.
So the industry tries to claim that we have a worldwide protein crisis. And the industry likes to claim that they are solving this problem. They are, in fact, contributing to the problem. They're making it much, much worse because of what Doug just described, this wholesale taking of all these massive numbers of fish out of what used to be sustainable fisheries. So the problem is that the solution that Doug's referring to is that salmon, as you pointed out, are carnivorous. When they are born, they eat little insects in rivers. And as they migrate across the ocean, they eat wild fish, often krill, which is what makes them pink. So the issue is that they need a certain type of protein in order to grow and thrive. And that protein, as it turns out, there are substitutes for it. One of them is the larva of black soldier flies. Another is algal oil, and there may be others too. And there's a lot of research being done about this around the world. I know France has a lot of it. There's some in the States, I think. We happen to have visited a plant very close to us called Oberlin Agriscience. And they grow black soldier fly larvae. And they're just completing an initial study to see how much of the black soldier fly larvae can be used as a substitute for wild fish. And initially, when they went into it, they thought that 100% of the feed, the protein requirements for wild fish could come from the larva and algal oil. I don't know where the numbers have ended up because the study is due out in about a month. And then in the grow out period, when the salmon are reaching their market size, it would be down to half. But that still leaves an enormous number of wild fish in the ocean. These are fish that could be consumed by human beings. These are not trash fish, the way the industry likes to describe them. And it's not just salmon aquaculture that uses these wild fish. There are other types of carnivorous fish like sea bream, grease. They use it in pet food. they use it. Where else do they use it? Anyway, so if this is a potential, lobsters. In order to catch lobsters, you need bait. Right now, they use wild fish. If the lobster industry in this province alone, this little tiny province of 1 million people, were to substitute black soldier fly protein as a bait, they'd leave, I think it's something like 50 or 60 million fish a year in the water. I mean, these solutions are out there if you try.
Do we know if the omega-3 content is affected by switching from, sort of these wild fish meal to black soldier flies? Does that affect the omega-3 content of the?
It's
of
a
the
terrific
fish?
question. I can't wait to read that report.
Yeah, we're not sure yet.
I know another one of those, solutions or sort of responses is to, haven't they done a lot of work on getting soybeans into the protein content, and maybe corn? But when you do that, aren't you lowering the omega-3? So you're in this sort of bind if you're trying to produce a high omega-3 product.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, and you do need some fish meal and fish oil in there to ensure a reasonable level of omega-3s. I believe that the preliminary results show that the black soldier fly and the algal oil larva and the algal oil will keep the omega-3 levels where they're supposed to be. And you also, by using this alternative feed, you're not getting the PCBs that come from the pelagic fish because they live on the bottom and they eat. The PCBs are a forever chemical. They've been banned since the early 1970s in the U.S. and most other places, but they're still here in our air, in our water, and so we need to get them out of there. And this is one alternative for doing that.
It's such a neat solution because you know what these black soldier flies eat? Green bin waste, restaurant waste. So it's a wonderful circle.
I did a piece on this for Mother Jones maybe 5 years ago because there is a lot of fish meal or fish oil and fish meal that ends up in poultry in the United States. Because poultry at a certain phase, I think they need the protein of fish meal, and there has been some work done about using black soldier flies, and you can sort of use them at the end of waste streams. You can grow them at the end of waste streams, and it's very encouraging research. And you're probably not going to get a lot of animal rights advocates mad about factory farming of black soldier fly larvae, but
you would hope not. But a funny story.
Careful.
When we were researching this book, we were talking to a lawyer who represented a group that was suing Cook Aquaculture, one of the largest independent salmon farmer in the world, and suing them for very bad practices at one of their hatcheries and for false advertising. And we said to him, we were talking about feed, and we said to this lawyer, there's an alternative. Black soldier fly larva can provide this protein. And he said, do you think those black soldier flies need lawyers?
I think he was making a joke.
I think so.
Yeah. But yeah, that's an interesting thing to watch. And so just to just sort of tie the knot on the PCBs, they exist at really small levels in these anchovies and sardines and these tiny bottom feeding fish, and they're not really a problem to consume them because they're at such tiny levels. But when you sort of turn them into fish meal and feed them into salmon, then they accumulate and become a problem. Is that basically right?
Exactly right. One of the people who really was illuminating for me to talk to is a doctor at NYU called Leonardo Cresande, and he writes about children's health and problems in children's health. And he was just dumbfounded when he was talking about the PCBs that still remain in very small levels in the salmon you eat, but how they accumulate over your body. And he gave us a very strong interview about why pregnant women especially should not be eating farmed salmon.
But he said it's a balancing act, trying to meet our requirements for these things, for omega-3s and 6s, and while reducing the risk of the exposure to these chemicals. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's other foods you can eat.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to figure out.
And we turn to omega-3 rich foods for the very reason of helping develop brains. Like, little children are supposed to get plenty of omega-3s, and it puts you in a bind when they come with, these other chemicals.
Yes.
Yeah, it sure does.
Your book is just rich with lots of anecdotes, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the rise of farm salmon in Norway and how it started off as this sort of small project and then just ballooned and became this multi-billion-dollar industry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it did start in the late 60s and early 70s in the fjords of Norway, where because the farmland there is not particularly productive, farmers were looking for another income source. And so they created small pens along the coastline and started raising salmon, which were very plentiful in the wild there. And they started farming them. And at that level, they were causing no harm. You didn't have 100,000 in one cage or 1 million in one farm. You had very small numbers. But as people saw that they could become profitable, particularly in Norway, which pioneered the salmon farming industry in open net pens, as people saw that, the farms grew larger and larger and larger. And as the scale increased, so did the damage to the environment, the damage to wild salmon. In Norway this summer, they put a ban on wild salmon fishing in a majority of their rivers because of the dangers that come from open net pen salmon farms in the fjords. So it started small, and like so many things, it grew into this monster. It's like feedlots for cattle. It's like factory chickens, except with salmon, what happens under the water, we don't see. What happens in a feedlot, you can see. You can get videos, pictures of it. Factory chicken farms, you understand how horrible they are. And therefore, there have been some reforms. But getting reforms when you've got a hidden danger, like salmon farms, are 10% above the water, it's a lot harder because people can't see it. And that's why we tried to drive home the mortality rates and the damage that these salmon farms do to their own product. 25% of the fish die every year. That's astonishing.
System. One of the things that you raise that are hopeful in the book, in addition to these sort of developing alternative feed methods, is the idea of closed pen salmon farming. So taking them out of the sort of shoreline and putting them on land. Can you talk a little bit about the promise and challenge of that method?
It's land-based salmon. They're called RAS, recirculating aquaculture systems, and they're not all the same. Some are completely closed loop, and they release absolutely no water. And because these fish are raised on land, they never touch the ocean. They are not polluting the ocean, and they don't have to be treated with either antibiotics or other chemicals in order to fight pathogens in sea life. So at least that fish is raised in the environment. But not all salmon farms are the same. Some are releasing the effluent into ways, and that's not a good thing. But there are two here in Nova Scotia that are completely closed. There's one in the States called Superior Fresh. They've managed to trick these salmon into growing only in fresh water. And it's a very strong, good program as well.
Yeah, it's a good program. And Superior Fresh is maybe the best example because they raise the salmon and then the water is recycled into a 13-acre hydroponics plant next to the salmon tanks. So the hydroponics, the plants get the nutrients that come with the fish waste as it goes through there. And then it's cleaned by the plants and recirculated back to the salmon tanks after being run through biofilters and ultraviolet light filters. And there is a small amount of solid waste that is produced. It's taken out and put on a regenerative farm that adjoins the salmon plant as fertilizer. And then they use any water that leaks out of this, and they have a very small amount. They use that to water their wetlands nearby. So it's this wonderful ecosystem that they've created at Superior Fresh, and that is being replicated in various ways in many places around the world now.
But the problem is that this is technology, a very disruptive technology, and it takes effort. It's evolving right now as we speak. And their challenge is that the open net pen salmon farmers are freeloaders on the environment that belongs to every citizen of this world. The land-based salmon farmers have to purify, they have to bring in their water, purify their water. They have to have buildings. They use energy. They have computer systems to monitor the well-being of these fish at all times. It is a more expensive proposal to run a well-run land-based farm. But the technology is evolving and improving all the time. So it's rather hopeful. The thing is to even the playing field so that the open net pen salmon farmers don't get a free ride while these guys are footing the bill. And there's another way in which they can reduce their cost. And the ones here have reduced them enormously because they're getting their feed from 50 miles down the road. Whereas an open pen salmon farm is getting wild fish off the west coast of Africa that might be processed in Norway and then shipped to North America. That's an enormous carbon footprint. By simply shipping it across the province or across your state, you've reduced your carbon footprint and your cost enormously. So there are all sorts of elements, financial aspects of this that are going to determine its success, we think, right?
Right.
And you can also eat elsewhere on the trophic scale. You can eat other fish. You can avoid carnivorous fish. I'm a big fan of Arctic char.
Sardines and anchovies.
Yes.
Delicious, full of omega-3s. But, getting back to these sort of closed systems that are on land, because they have higher costs, it almost brings us back to where you have to pay up for salmon because, wild caught salmon is significantly more expensive than farm salmon usually. And the sort of explosion of farm salmon that you guys document has made us used to, getting really, really cheap salmon, making it a regular part of our diets because it's so much cheaper. And if we actually sort of cost in everything and even the playing field, then we're paying more for salmon again, and it's back to being more of a niche product. And because we're not going to be able to probably not going to be able to mass produce it at the scale we do now in closed systems.
But you have niche products, niche food products. Do you eat lobster every day? Do you eat meat? We don't eat a lot of meat. Fancy steaks every day? No. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having something that's special.
I'm totally agreeing with you on that. That there's probably a false promise of cheap and plentiful salmon because it is this remarkable fish that eats a bunch of other little fish, and that process makes it so rich in omega-3s, makes it so rich in protein, and it's probably a special thing and not an everyday thing. And I think we could do a similar episode on shrimp, which has also taken a similar trajectory of being this thing that was a special occasion food, and now we have all-you-can-eat shrimp buffets and things like that.
Right.
Yeah. Just why you have no more Red Lobster.
No, exactly. Now, Catherine, you alluded to this briefly, but you guys have been, plunged into this world for a while now. What advice do you have to the consumer, showing up at the supermarket fish case? What is a good way to get, how should people be thinking about salmon? Should they be thinking about alternatives to salmon, when it's time to feed the family?
That's a terrific question. I think that this is up to consumers, and there's a very interesting program that was launched last year by a UK-based charity called Wild Fish, and their goal is to protect the population of wild fish worldwide. And they were like all of us, running into a wall, waiting for the governments and regulators to do something about the scourge of these open feedlots on our oceans. And so they started a program called Off the Table. And instead of turning to the government and the regulators, they have turned to restaurants and chefs and asked them to take this pledge not to serve open net pan farmed salmon to their customers. And that campaign has since spread to Tasmania and Australia and Denmark, a little bit in the States, and we've launched it here in Canada. And the premise is that you're asking consumers to find a solution for this and to stop buying open net pan farmed salmon. So when I go to the fish store, if it isn't my local person whom I know very well, I say, that's interesting looking salmon. Where is it from? Where was it caught? What was the company from which you bought this? And there are certain companies from which I would never buy salmon. So just don't buy it. It's as simple as that. Don't buy it. And then, yeah.
And as you said earlier, there are alternatives. There are alternatives which provide you with the same proteins, the same omega-3s, and other nutrients that you need for your body. We're not arguing against eating fish by any means. You just have to be more selective. You have to eat lower down the food chain. I mean, we're seeing some amazing things in scallops that are raised safely on strings, in oysters, in clams,
kelp.
And kelp. You know, there are alternatives. Salmon has been made into an easy choice that the industry has convinced people is healthy. But it's not healthy, and the costs are far greater than what you are paying at the seafood counter in terms of impact on our environment, on wild salmon, and on your potentially on your health.
So you may be paying $10 a pound for farmed salmon right now today. Your children are never going to eat a salmon again. You know, think long term about this. And you had Paul Greenberg on a little bit ago, and he was talking about one of the solutions is to eat wild-caught fish from our own coastlines. Terrific idea. But this is why we have to think about aquaculture industry, which is taking wild fish off the coastlines in order to feed their fancy fish for us to, our underpriced fancy fish for us to eat in restaurants. No, we should change our choices. We should eat different fish and ensure the viability and of our wild fisheries, because they are the key to the future.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap it up. Thank you guys so much for being on Unconfined Podcast. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the good questions, too.
Thank you for having us.
This is an episode of Unconfined, a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu.